This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 330 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Wait for it. Thanks for tuning in. The quarterbacks I liked last week didn't do all that well, those being Baker Mayfield and Ryan Fitzpatrick. But the quarterbacks I didn't like, they didn't do that well either. That was Tom Brady and Josh Allen. At running back, Jamal Williams didn't do as well as I expected. I got Devontae Freeman right, and Tevin Coleman continued to not see the field, so that was a good call too. And then the big call of last week was Emmanuel Sanders, who ended up as the wide receiver 1. I also like Zach Pascal, so that was strong. Tight end was fine because of Tyler Higbee, but my main defensive pick, the Houston Texans, they sucked. So overall, I'd say it wasn't a terrible week, but I've had better. Off to week 15 we go. Now, before looking at players I'm higher and lower on this week versus the consensus, though, I wanted to remind you to play FanDuel's Thursday night special this week. Just pick players from the Ravens and Jets, make a lineup, and submit that lineup for $9. The prize pool is $700,000, with first place getting $100,000. Just head to FanDuel.com and check it out. I fielded a lot of questions about Dak Prescott this week, so I thought I'd kick off the quarterback talk today with him. I think he's being slightly undervalued by the consensus. Not by a ton, but at least a little bit. According to oddsfire.com, the Rams-Cowboys game total has gone up by 2 points at some sports books since it opened. That's the right kind of line movement that you want to see. It's now got a 49-point over-under on FanDuel Sportsbook, making it one of the higher scoring games of the week. So that's good for Dak. As is the fact that he's finished outside the top 15 in weekly quarterback scoring only twice this year. He scored fewer than 17 fantasy points only 2 times. You may look at the last couple of weeks and say that he produced in garbage time, which isn't wrong. But if Dallas is in this game and there isn't garbage time, Dak is likely going to have something to do with it. Dak has also scored 4.7 more points per game than the points per game average that his opponents have allowed. He's been a great fantasy asset. He's been a top 5 quarterback. And as my colleague Jim Sonis pointed out on Twitter yesterday, at home this season, Prescott's yards per attempt rate is 8.8. On the road, that falls to 7.4. And as we know, this game's being played in Dallas. So I'm in on Dak this week, and I think he's a safe top 10 option and potentially a top 5 one. Now, I know Baker Mayfield failed me last week, but he's really hard to ignore this week. Arizona's allowed 6.1 points above expectation to opposing quarterbacks this year. Meaning quarterbacks have scored 6 more points than their season-long points per game averages against the Arizona Cardinals. Cleveland's a road favorite, and that game also has a high-ish over-under. And I've said this a ton on the show, but for as bad as Mayfield's been for fantasy purposes, things haven't been as bad when you adjust for strength of schedule. Now, because of last week's performance, things do look a little bit worse than they did heading into last week. But he's only played a point or two below expectation from a production standpoint. And based on his yardage total, he should have over 4 more touchdowns than he currently has. He's a positive regression candidate. Things can very easily come together for Mayfield this week against Arizona. Now, if you're super desperate at quarterback, I don't mind Eli Manning at all, really. I think he's being overlooked. The Dolphins' secondary is banged up, and they've been bad all year. Only Arizona's been the better matchup when adjusted for strength of opponent. And you could also think of Manning from the perspective of his pass catchers. Over on Fantasy Pros this week, Sterling Shepard, Golden Tate, and Darius Slayton are all top 35 wide receivers. Ranking players doesn't show variance, but it shows us that the expectation for this Giants offense and passing attack, the expectations are pretty high. Eli's not a bad streaming option this week. I'd likely only be playing Ryan Fitzpatrick over him from a streaming perspective. Now, on the other side of things, I alluded to this on yesterday's 10 Trends show, but Russell Wilson is ranked too high in my opinion. Not that he shouldn't be played, I just think the QB5 ranking is high. He should be closer to QB10. As you guys heard yesterday, Wilson hasn't exactly been the best fantasy quarterback over the second half of the season. Since week 6, he's given fantasy managers just one top 12 QB1 performance. He's averaging 17.5 points per game during that time, but he's actually hit 17 points only once. He had a monster game against Tampa Bay that's really skewing his averages. And he's faced plus matchups in there. Philly was sort of a borderline plus matchup, at least in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed, and Atlanta was a good one. And honestly, Carolina, when adjusted for strength of opponent, they've been pretty good against fantasy quarterbacks. They've allowed almost 3 points below expectation to opposing passers. So if we pretend that Wilson's expectation against a neutral team is like 19 fantasy points right now, which is honestly better than how he's been performing, then you're looking at about 16 points this week. But the real fear I have with this game is that the Panthers can't stop the run to save their lives. They've got the worst rush defense in football. Seattle, meanwhile, has been one of the most run-heavy teams in neutral game scripts this year. That tells us that they want to run the football, and they should be able to run the football. And that'll limit Russell Wilson's touchdown upside in this game. So I don't mind him, but I wouldn't be playing him over someone like Ryan Tannehill this week. And then there's Aaron Rodgers. I'm not sure what Aaron Rodgers has done to warrant a low-end QB1 ranking against the Chicago Bears this week. They've been one of the better defenses against fantasy quarterbacks this year, and Aaron Rodgers has been a pretty replaceable quarterback all year long. He's the QB9 in points per game among all passers with 10 or more games played. The game this weekend has a pretty low over-under as well. Rodgers should be a mid-range QB2 this week, in my opinion. Now, I thought that Kenyon Drake was a little bit undervalued this week. I know David Johnson scored a touchdown last week, but he still only had 3 carries and 2 targets. Drake continued to be used as the featured back. He had a 73% running back rush share and a near 11% target share. That gives us 2 straight weeks now that he's seen at least those 2 numbers in those 2 categories. And now this week he gets Cleveland. It's a higher scoring game, it's projected to be close, and Cleveland's been below average against fantasy running backs this year. Drake's currently at RB22, but I'd be a little more confident in using him than that. Patrick Laird is more undervalued than Kenyon Drake, though. He's at RB30, but I think he's a solid low-end RB2 this week. Look, over the last 2 weeks, Laird's seen his snap share increase, and his workload has also increased as a result. In Week 14, Laird handled 79% of Miami's running back rushes, and he had a target share north of 14%. The Dolphins' offense has been better over the second half of the season, which should give you a little bit more confidence in using one of their running backs, especially against the Giants. They haven't been anything special against the position this year. So I think that Laird is a really safe, high-floor option this week in PPR formats. Now, I know that I mentioned Ronald Jones as a sell candidate last week on the 15 Transaction Show, and I think the point is still very valid. You've got to be willing to take a risk to play Ronald Jones. He's a risky play given he missed a block and Bruce Arians yanked him in Week 13. But he did bounce back usage-wise in Week 14. He had half of Tampa Bay's running back rushes, and he had a target share of 11%. The matchup against Detroit this week is awesome since they've been one of the top 5 friendliest matchups for opposing running backs this year. But there's also a little bit of intrigue and a boost in target share for Ronald Jones because Mike Evans is out. Now, I don't love Jones because he's not very predictable, but this is a good spot for him. Devontae Freeman came through last week, but you cannot love his matchup this week against San Francisco. The 49ers have been the second best team against running backs this season when adjusted for strength of opponent, and they've really been in their own tier with the Buccaneers. Freeman should see some sort of floor given that he's a lock to handle over half the team's running back carries and see probably like a 10% target share. But you have to be concerned about the matchup. He's an RB3 this week despite that usage. You just have to hope that he can find the end zone or that there's a ton of dump-offs and garbage time. And then there's Devin Singletary. I think if you've got Singletary, he's probably better than your alternatives. So you probably have to play him. And like I talked about on yesterday's 10 Trends show, things are moving in the right direction for him. This past week, he had 81% of Buffalo's running back rushes and a 22% target share. So he's fine enough. But Pittsburgh's been really good against opposing running backs. In fact, no running back has finished in the weekly top 12 or an RB1 performance against the Steelers this year. So Singletary should be okay enough. Just temper your expectations. A common trend all season long has been the Eagles' inability to defend the perimeter. Even though they've allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, quarterbacks against the Eagles are targeting the slot at the lowest rate in football. Enter Terry McLaurin. McLaurin's played just 24% of his snaps from the slot this year, and he's averaged a 28% target share over his last 3 games. He's in a great spot to produce. Zach Pascal's pretty interesting this week too. The Colts have a matchup against the Saints secondary that was beat up last week against the 49ers. They've actually given up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wideouts this year. They've been especially bad against the slot, which is why I liked Emmanuel Sanders last week. No team has allowed more receptions and targets to that area of the field than the Saints this year. And Pascal has played close to 40% of his snaps from the slot over the last 2 weeks. He'll be moved around, but that's at least a little bit encouraging. As is the fact that his target share is about 23% without T.Y. Hilton in the lineup this year. Now, I honestly can't find many wide receivers this week that I disagree with rankings-wise. I will say, I think Allen Hurns is interesting if Devontae Parker can't go, given his 23% target share this past week. And you can also look at Chris Conley or Keelan Cole if DJ Chark can't go. But most wide receiver sleepers this week are likely coming as a result of an injury. And I just don't have all of that information yet. But on the other side of things, Robbie Anderson and Jamison Crowder are really tough to be into this week against Baltimore. Over on Fantasy Pros, Robbie's the wide receiver 36 and Jamison Crowder's the wide receiver 37. But I think both should be ranked outside the 30s. Baltimore's been awesome defensively, especially after they got Marcus Peters. They also haven't given up a top 12 wide receiver 1 performance since week 9. And that's after facing the Texans, Rams, 49ers, and Bills. I'd honestly rather risk one of the players who's going to benefit from an injury than play one of the Jets' pass catchers. And then I saw that John Brown and Cole Beasley have drastically different rankings this week, with Brown at wide receiver 25 and Beasley at wide receiver 41. But Beasley's the one with the better matchup. I think Brown's slightly overvalued because the Steelers can limit opposing wide receivers, but they've seen 37% of their passes against them this year go to the slot. That's the highest rate in the league. So teams are utilizing that area of the field against the Steelers, which is a common thing for Pittsburgh in recent history. And that favors slot receiver Cole Beasley matchup-wise. I would be trying to avoid both players this week, though. If Greg Olsen is out again, Ian Thomas is a great play against the Seahawks. You guys already know this if you listened to yesterday's 10 Trends show, though. The Seahawks are almost as bad at stopping tight ends as the Cardinals are, even though everyone always talks about the Cardinals. That's if you adjust for strength of opponent. And Thomas had a really strong 25% target share last week without Greg Olsen, so he's in a great spot to produce. Mike Gesicki didn't come through last week for fantasy managers, but I think that you can go back to him this week. He still saw 14% of Miami's targets a week ago, and that was his lowest share since week 8. So the volume has been pretty strong, and there could be a natural uptick for him from a volume perspective if Devontae Parker can't go. The Kansas City defense is my top streaming defense this week. They really check all the boxes. They're at home, they're facing an inexperienced quarterback, and they're big favorites. Now, Drew Lock hasn't faced a negative game script yet, but he likely will this week. So there's upside for that Kansas City defense as a result. But two deeper plays are actually from the same game, and that's Detroit and Tampa Bay. For Detroit, you've got no Mike Evans to deal with, and Jameis Winston has a messed up thumb. Even with a healthy team, the Bucs have allowed opposing defenses to score 2.6 more points than their season-long averages this year. They've been a plus matchup. With Detroit playing at home, they're not a terrible play. But Tampa Bay isn't either. They're facing a backup quarterback, Marvin Jones is now on IR, and the Bucs are favorites in this game. So realistically, as two really deep plays, you could look at either defense in this matchup. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Mailbag Show.